This year marks the 90th anniversary of the Long March by the Red Army, one of the greatest revolutionary feats of the 20th century. We'll discuss the historical significance of this event and how it connects to present-day China on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, a new show produced in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee, along with my co-host, KJ Noh. KJ, why don't you get us started with this week's headlines?
Hong Kong authorities sentenced 45 people for implementing a constitutional weapon of mass destruction. The Hong Kong judiciary has handed down prison sentences to 45 people guilty of attempting to subvert and overthrow the Hong Kong government. As the US-backed Colour Revolution was raging in 2019 in Hong Kong, a group of activists attempted to overthrow the Hong Kong government by conducting an illegal primary election engineered to select legislators who would continuously veto the budget until the government collapsed. This would freeze all spending, shutting down schools, hospitals, utilities, public services, and create mass chaos. The organizer of this plan, the NDI-affiliated Benny Tai, argued publicly in Apple Daily that this would escalate violence, trigger government crackdown, and bring down sanctions by Western powers. He referred to this plan as a constitutional weapon of mass destruction. Elections in every country are tightly regulated by conducting an unauthorized extra administrative primary legislative election, which they had been warned not to conduct. The organizers had already run afoul of the law by designing and publicizing it to select only candidates seeking to shut down the government and wreak havoc and damage the city. The court adjudicated that the organizers and participants had crossed the line into seditious activity and handed down sentences ranging from 50 months to 10 years. The U.S., which politically and legislatively supported the rioters seeking to overthrow the Hong Kong government and enable their activity with millions of funding, has criticized the convictions vociferously. However, the U.S. has arrested and prosecuted its own citizens much more severely for far less, most notably in the riots of January 6.
President Xi Jinping held his final meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden on November 16th in Lima. During the dialogue, Xi emphasized some of the key experiences and lessons of U.S.-China relations from the past 4 years, chief among them, that a new Cold War cannot and should not be fought, containment of China is unwise, undesirable, and will not succeed, that there should be more dialogue and cooperation between the two nations, that the development of China-U.S. relations should always focus on the well-being of both peoples and gather the strength of both peoples, that both should demonstrate great power responsibility and play a positive role in world unity and not coerce other countries to take sides. Most importantly, she emphasized that the Taiwan issue, democracy and human rights, development path and development rights are China's 4 red lines, which cannot be challenged. Of the Taiwan issue, she stressed that cross-strait peace and stability and Taiwan independence activities are as irreconcilable as water and fire, and that if the U.S. were serious about maintaining peace in the Taiwan Strait, it would support peaceful reunification of China. She also stated emphatically, quote, "The Chinese people's right to development is not to be deprived of or ignored, and that China has the right to develop as any other country." He warned the U.S. not to, quote, "overstretch the national security concept and use it as a pretext for malicious moves to constrain and contain other countries." In other words, use national security as a pretext to curtail China's development. This was possibly the most straightforward language Xi has used with Biden or any other U.S. president, with some analysts saying that it's a signal to the incoming Trump administration that any moves to cross these stated red lines or thwart China's economic development will immediately be seen as hostile actions.
Chinese scientists invent revolutionary solar-powered desalination device. Chinese scientists working at the Shanghai Jiaotong University and MIT have invented a solar-powered desalination device that produces potable water cheaply and effectively, using a technique called thermohaline convection-enhanced solar distillation that mimics the natural convection system of the ocean, but condensing it down to millimeter scale. The system, using a small suitcase-sized device powered by the sun, can create 4 to 6 liters of drinkable distilled water per hour, enough for a family. The invention has the potential to transform water access in places where water access is limited, restricted, or weaponized, for example, as currently in Palestine, and revolutionize sustainable water production around the world.
Cancer survival rates are on the rise in China. According to the National Cancer Center, in China, the overall 5-year survival rate of cancer in the country has been increasing year by year from 30.9% at the beginning of 2000 to 43.7% by 2022. The incidence of cancer in China matches the global average with a slightly higher mortality rate. At the same time, the speed of the overall increase in the cancer survival rate has approached that of developed countries. This is due to a number of factors, including early diagnosis and treatment projects promoted by the National Cancer Center, the increased accessibility of cutting-edge cancer prevention and treatment methods, and the increase of specialized cancer departments in hospitals across the country. China's overall 5-year cancer survival rate is expected to continue to go up and reach 46.6% by 2030.
Western media claims up to 100,000 North Korean troops to be sent to Russia. Despite being unable to provide any substantive evidence of North Korean troops in Russia, Western media keeps inflating the number deployed or to be deployed, starting with 1,500 special forces and escalating to 3,000, 4,000, 10,000, 11,000, and 15,000. The latest figures from Bloomberg magazine claim that up to 100,000 North Korean troops could be deployed in batches into the war in Ukraine, the equivalent in total numbers of an entire field army. Experts in military science have stated that because of the lack of interoperability between the forces, it would make no sense to deploy North Korean troops and would actually obstruct military operations in the complex net-centric tactical environment that relies on instant, error-free communication and coordination. Despite the evidence-free nature of these claims, the US and other G7 nations have condemned China for failing to pressure North Korea to withdraw its support of Russia, and have also cited the presence of North Korean troops as justifying the escalatory use of ATACMS, a bright red line for the Russians.
This past October marked the 90th anniversary of the Long March. 90 years ago, the Red Army and its peasant supporters began their year-long trek, traversing 6,000 miles, 18 mountains, and 24 rivers across China. They marched an average of over 30 miles a day, and as they were pursued by enemy soldiers from behind, engaged in battle nearly every 72 hours. The march started with 86,000 people, and along the way, many starved, were killed, defected, or gave up. In the end, only 8,000 soldiers remained. To talk more about one of the greatest revolutionary feats of the 20th century, we are honored to have on returning guest Tings Chak. She recently wrote an article for People's Dispatch for the 90th anniversary of the Long March. Tings is a researcher and art director at the Tricontinental Institute. Tings, welcome back to the China Report.
Thank you so much for having me again, Amanda and KJ.
Yeah, of course. We're glad to have you back. Last month, you wrote a really nice reflection essay on 90 years after the Long March for People's Dispatch. Now, we usually cover China from the perspective of US geopolitics on this show. So we rarely get a chance to delve into Chinese history, right? So, for those that may not know, can you give us a little bit of an introduction to the Long March? What it was, its historical significance in China, and maybe also some of the major accomplishments of this significant event.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you've already introduced some of the key elements of the Long March. I think it's one of these legends, especially for those of us from the left, not only for China, but for revolutionary movements around the world. It's been memorialized in so many films and stories and poems and books. But so for this anniversary, I wanted to have a look at the Long March for sort of what it meant in the stage of the revolutionary process. Where were they leaving from and where were they headed to? And maybe some lessons that can be important for us today, thinking about organization, socialist experimentation, and really the capacity, even in the most difficult of times, to mobilize the masses into a national and a revolutionary project. And those, I think, are less talked about when we talk about the Long March. I want to start with, a slogan I think many people know about, which is crossing the river while feeling the stones, which is a saying that was coined by Chen Yun in 1950, but more closely associated with Deng Xiaoping during the opening up reform period. But I think that's an important sort of mantra to think about the Chinese revolutionary process. And the Long March was one of those really long journeys in this crossing the river while feeling the stones to figure out a new stage. And one thing I guess I wanted to talk about is where the communists were leaving from to go on this what is seen as a strategic retreat, because of course the nationalists, with the support of Nazi German advisors, were being targeted in a series of military encirclements. And the fifth one, they had to retreat and embark on this historic march. But where they were based was the first real, let's say, socialist experimentation in an area that the communists had governed, and it's called the Chinese Soviet Republic, and Ruijin in the Jiangxi province. And I just wanted to say that in those short years, it was established in 1931, and the Long March started 90 years ago in 1934. In those few short years, there were huge experiments being made in all areas. For example, in land reform. Land reform didn't start after 1941. It started well before, and 2 decades before, where we have experiments of distributing land to peasants. And in that period, 10,000 cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, were already established, amongst other types of cooperatives. The Red Army grew to tens of thousands of members. We have the first institutions and governance structures. Many of them still exist today, and perhaps with a new name. For example, the first bank that the communists were able to run. And really interestingly, the currency that they created to be able to bypass all these economic sanctions being imposed on the Soviet government, which isn't quite new. It's something that we live in most of the parts of the world today. The currency they had, the 1 yuan, the lowest denominator currency, had the face of Lenin. So they were, this is a nice anecdote, but they were experimenting with banking. They were creating all the infrastructure we know today around media, for example, radio and communications. The precursor to what is the state media called Xinhua was created there as well as policies and programs like eliminating unemployment, the usage of opium, child slavery, forced marriages. So a lot of these kind of programs that became solidified in the People's Republic of China really began its experimentation in this early period. Of course, after this Long March, they had to start all over again in the Yan'an base. And there, from those 8,000 people you mentioned, Amanda, in 10 years grew to govern areas of over 100 million people. So this is really, those 2 decades prior to the formation of PRC, is this period of socialist experimentation that I think is really, really valuable, and perhaps closer to the realities of many sort of movements and organizations and parties thinking about a sort of revolutionary program, even today, obviously in very different conditions.
Well, one of the things that Mao was really serious about combating was this idea of Han chauvinism. And over the course of the Long March, the CPC traveled through a lot of different ethnic minority areas. And I think there's this idea of Han supremacy in China, which even Western leftists subscribe to. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how the CPC combated this idea of, Han chauvinism and, you know, what role going through these ethnic minority regions, what it played in the Long March, and how did they unify all of these people under this one political program?
Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect because I think a lot of people don't realize how diverse China is as much as there is a majority who belong to the Han group, including myself. But Han itself is actually really, really diverse. I mean, we speak different languages, we eat different foods, we have different religions. So it's also a construction over a long, long history of identification with an ancient dynasty. But that being said, there are 56 ethnicities. And of course, for the Long March and for the communists to succeed in this process, you really have to, you're going through territories where people have never heard of what a communist is. They don't know what your program is, if you're to be trusted. I mean, remember in that period, that the whole territory of China was highly contested between warlords to nationalists to all kinds of different, correlation of forces. It's not like if you march into a territory where you've never met and you don't even speak the language, people are going to trust you or even let you survive and get through the territory. So a lot of the work that the communists did was building from also the kind of experimental phase in Beijing about how to deal with the peasant masses. One of the things was a work method that was developed already called the 3 rules of discipline and 8 points of attention. I won't go into all of them, but they're things like, okay, don't take anything from the masses. Return everything that you borrowed. If you need anything, you pay for it fairly. You don't harm people's crops. You don't abuse any women or children, or even the people you've captured. All these kinds of things were kind of a set of moral codes that the communists had to sort of operate by, and through that gain trust and massify the party with a peasant support. And so this was also practiced along the Long March route, going through many, many territories of different ethnic minority groups. In fact, during that Long March, there were at least 10 ethnic minority regions, like Miao group, Yi, or Tibetan, many, many different groups. Around half the territories that the communists crossed through were actually ethnic minority regions. And so in the process, it's also around, sharing what the communist program is. There are things around, kinds of political equality or opposing this, Han chauvinism or ethnic oppression was part of the question of, how do you join forces to fight against the local landlords or the warlords, and a variety of things that really respond to the concrete needs of the people. And in one example that in Sichuan province, was in a particularly difficult part to pass through, the Red Army really depended on the local Yi people. And so in that experience, actually, by the end of them crossing through, there was actually a special detachment of Yi people of the Red Army that was formed. So they really joined in the forces as a process of, going through, but also that education, the conscientization, and also the building of trust. So one of the big aspects of that Long March is really sharing the program of the communists with a large part of the population that had never knew what the communists were up to, and certainly didn't have much trust of the communists, the nationalists or other forces in the region.
You mentioned the importance of the ethnic minorities, but can you say also something about the importance of women in the Long March and during the revolution?
Yeah, I think this is always something we have to emphasize because, I think many people can name people like Mao Zedong or Zhou Enlai, but very rarely can name a Chinese woman in the revolutionary process. So women actively participated, like women have always participated throughout the revolutionary process, but in the Long March as well. And one of the really important parts were around providing food and clothing. The soldiers on the Long March use these sort of, they're made from a kind of reed, I guess, shoes. They're very kind of sandals, not quite shoes, but a lot of those types of things, shoes, sandals, the clothing were prepared by the women along the way. So these are kind of the peasant supporters. They might not have gone on the Long March, but were, supporters of the cause. In the actual Long March, though the vast majority were men by far, there were some women, at least recorded numbers, around 32 women in the Red Army. All of them actually survived through the whole march, and they played critical roles, usually in the agitation and propaganda teams, because of course throughout, it's not just sharing, like we talked about with the local masses, what the communists were doing and why they were there, but also around mobilizing the sort of spirit of the Red Army soldiers to continue marching in this really treacherous situations. There were like theater troops, music troops, and others. And women are also played an important role for caring for wounded soldiers, as well as gathering resources. It could be intelligence resources to financial resources to material resources as the army went through the territories. So these were at least some of the key roles that women played along the Long March. And there's a nice photo, unfortunately I didn't get to send it to you right before, but of the women who had actually gone on the Long March, and they took a photo together in 1949 after the declaration of the People's Republic of China. And that's one of my favorite pictures because, they were all together to see this, long journey through, not only till the end of the Long March, but really to the establishment of the socialist state. And it's really quite beautiful. But maybe I can share it with you afterwards and you can add it in a link or something.
Absolutely. Well, Tings, one of the ways that the Long March connects to the present day, and not a lot of people know this, is that Xi Jinping, as a teenager during the Cultural Revolution, he was sent to Yan'an in the 1970s, I want to say, and he lived there for 7 years in a cave in very humble conditions. And he worked alongside the peasantry. And I imagine that it had a really profound effect on him, farming with the peasantry and living in these really modest conditions. When he became an adult, he was quoted as saying, "One thing I wish most often at the time was to make it possible for the villagers to have meat and have it often." Because, when you live in a developing country, you don't have that same kind of access to meat as, we do. So, how do you see that experience that she had living in those conditions in light of his policies and, the CPC policies today and the self-correction of the party under his leadership?
No, I think that's a really important point. And I had the chance to go last year during May Day or International Workers' Day, May 1st, to Yan'an. It was my first time, even though I've been researching that history for quite a while. And then I had a chance to go to the village, Liangjiahe, which is exactly where Xi Jinping had been sent. It's still a very humble village. Today, of course, nothing like it was in the 1970s. It's a picture I think you have up now I took. Unfortunately, you won't be able to see him as the young person in the background, but those are the I think that's the picture.
Yeah, this is
those
the
are the
picture of when he went back to Beijing in the 1970s too to visit his parents, but it was around that time.
Oh, great. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because now it's still a very humble village. And everyone there who lives in the village remembers stories of when, she was a young boy, a young teenager, and went there, including things, he was known to be quite a bookworm. So he read a lot. And in the beginning parts, he said he didn't like living there. He wasn't used to the food. He wasn't used to the culture. The language was different, or at least the dialects were different and different things. Because remember, Xi Jinping was the son of the vice premier. He grew up in Zhongnanhai. He grew up around the halls of power. So he, as a teenager, to go from Beijing, the capital of the country, to a really far underdeveloped region is quite a shock. So he's 15 years old. So in that early period, not to romanticize anything, it's not like he adjusted very easily to that. But it took that 7 years of living, working, eating, struggling together, that he actually came out. And two actually important things. One of them is that he tried in those 7 years to join the CPC. He applied 9 times and failed 9 times. for all kinds of different reasons, perhaps. But anyways, on the 10th, he was accepted, and he started his political career as a village party secretary in that small village. So he really, over 30 years, worked to gain the position that he is today. And the second thing is, by the time he actually went back to Beijing, as at that time 22 years old, to start his university degree at Tsinghua, he had went as a peasant soldier worker identity. So he really sort of worked his way to gain the trust and to gain the confidence in the political trust, really, to be able to kind of return to Beijing and then pursue his political career after that. One of the things that I think President Xi said that is that there's no other project that he spent more time on than the struggle against poverty. And I firmly believe that without this experience as a teenager in the most formative period where he got to understand what living amongst the peasants was like, that without that, I don't think we would have seen some of the huge commitments to the question of the rural development, rural revitalization, poverty alleviation, everything we've seen in his in his third term now.
Well, you mentioned a few minutes ago that you had the opportunity to visit Ruijin, where the Long March started, and then Yan'an, where it ended. And conditions there are still like pretty humble, pretty modest. I guess I'm just curious, how is the memory and the revolutionary spirit of this historical event, the Long March, kept alive in places like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually really connected to the policies that we're seeing today, whether it's the poverty alleviation or the rural revitalization, which is the phase after. So one of the things is, oh, great, you got this footage. I actually had a chance to visit there as well. One of those first generation leaders, like Mao Zedong or even Xi's father, went on this long march and they left Beijing. But one of the big regrets was that they never had a chance to go back. They never got to go back to the people. The people of Beijing really, really made a huge sacrifice. Because one of the things is that in order for the Long March, the Red Army, to move forward, 10,000 people basically volunteered to sacrifice their lives to hold the line so that the columns could leave and buy time. And basically those 10,000 people would have become martyred in that process. So every single person in these villages in Beijing today will have a story still of a relative who left for the Long March or who stayed behind to defend the Long March, who they never saw again. So it's a very alive story. But then what has been done, I think, in the last really decade is try to return back to these areas with the poverty alleviation program and rural revitalization program to try to think of different ways. For example, we were just talking about Guangdong right before we started the program, is now Beijing is also paired with some of the wealthier cities in Guangdong to be in this, pairing assistance program that we see a lot, where you pair a more wealthier, more developed part of the country with an underdeveloped part, and there's all kinds of exchange in terms of capital investments from enterprises, state and private enterprises, or sharing of resources, or bringing of students and teachers, and even local leaders to be able to exchange and try to teach and help the local development. So that kind of thing we're seeing now in Beijing. But in terms of keeping the spirit alive, it's one of the big aspects of, especially under Xi, has been trying to increase the amount of knowledge of red history and red tourism, how to incentivize especially young people to get to know this earlier revolutionary history. So these sites today are really well preserved and maintained, the historical sites themselves, some of the footage you're seeing here, and also building new sites. In Yan'an, there are new museums. There's new museums everywhere in the country, but there's also arts and cultural centers that are specifically focused on this part of the history, or even sometimes new districts that are to connect with the red, to stimulate more. It could be tourism. So where of people travel to, including school groups. I think you had some footage of young kids going there. It's very common to see school groups. You have party activities, so people organize within the party. So one of the really interesting things is that especially since Xi came to his presidency, is the preservation of red history and the promotion of red tourism. So many of these places, these historical sites, are really well preserved and maintained. A lot of investment has been put into maintaining them, but also new sites have been built. So, for example, in Yan'an, there are new museums, but museums are all over the country, but new museums specifically there. There are performance centers with, plays and interactive theater pieces that are specifically around this Yan'an history. There are even new districts that are, there for promoting, red tourism that are created. So what you see is that there are a lot of people, in addition to stimulating domestic tourism, is that there's also student groups. I think some of the images you've shown show that, where school groups will go and visit to learn about their history. There's a lot of party activities, and for those of the people who are in the party. And what's interesting is you'll also see a lot of team building exercises. People from even private businesses will organize a lot of team building trips to these places. So they're very much supported right now, as well as being frequented. Anytime I've been to any of these historical sites, there's always tons of groups, and it's really exciting to see the investment in it and also the interest in this history.
So, Tings, you have pointed out that the Long March was an inspiration to people around the world. And, I'm just thinking, off the top of my head, Mike Tyson has said, I read Mao's book. I was right there next to Mao on that long effing march. So, clearly the Long March resonates and inspires all kinds of people to this day. But you're speaking to us from Brazil right now. Brazil and China, they're major agrarian societies. They had large organized peasant movements, and China's culminating in a revolutionary people's war and ultimately a socialist people state. But what were the effects of the Long March and the Chinese Revolution on Brazil, on that part of the world? What happened in Brazil, and what were the connections to China?
Yeah, I mean, this year is the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties between Brazil and China. But one of the things is that the relationship, especially between revolutionaries of Brazil and the two countries, extended well before, basically since the establishment of the People's Republic of China. So 20 years before any official ties were made. And one of the things that's interesting is that Brazil actually had its own Long March. It preceded the Chinese one in the 1920s. Prestes, who actually became later on the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Brazil, at the time he wasn't yet, organized his own march called the Coluna Prestes, the Prestes column. And then later on, as the General Secretary, he did visit China in the 1950s. His writings and writings about him were translated to Chinese. So that's an interesting connection between two countries, agrarian societies that had processes of long marches. But Prestige is just one amongst many of the leftist and revolutionary leaders, intellectuals, artists, to visit and learn from the Chinese revolutionary experience and exchange. And it was actually, around 60 years ago, a little bit more, where we have some of the key leaders of the largest peasant movement in Brazil from the Northeast, which historically until today, one of the more poor regions, but also where the peasants have been very mobilized. And at that time, it was called the Peasant Leagues. And it was this grouping of people, the communists, whether they were part of the party or not, organized in social movements like peasant movements. It's these people that were very much targeted when there was the 1964 coup in Brazil, which is 60 years this year. And in fact, many of the people that were targeted, exactly those who are slowly getting closer, not only with the Soviet Union, but also with the People's Republic of China. So sometimes when we look at some of the anti-communist or the anti-China narratives, they're kind of being recycled from that period of the Cold War, and also between many of these countries. At that time, we were known as third world countries. Now we call it Global South. I just published an essay in Monthly Review that came out today. So for anyone who's interested, it has it's actually quite a long essay, maybe a bit too long, about this history and the long exchanges between China and Brazil. Oh, I actually haven't seen it published, so thanks for pulling that up. That's very cool.
So you're referring to the coup. This was a coup in 1964 by the military that overthrew the progressive government of Goulart. And then for decades after that, Brazil was a military dictatorship. And then it went through IMF reforms. And, as you point out, there's still poverty in Brazil. Now, China has ended extreme poverty. To the best of my knowledge, nobody in China goes hungry anymore. But hunger still stalks the Brazilian people, despite being one of the greatest agricultural producers. Many Brazilians are still food insecure. And, this is despite Lula's Zero Hunger program initiated over a decade ago. So, can you tell us a little bit about the political economy of food production in Brazil today? And how are China-Brazil relations affecting that situation? If you can bring us up to date on China-Brazil relations in the current moment.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of poverty, hunger, these are some of the biggest dilemmas facing humanity. And they're big questions, I think, that both Brazil under Lula's leadership as well as China under Xi's leadership have really confronted and shown a lot of leadership in. One of the things is actually, I'm here now where Rio is hosting the G20, where both the presidents are attending amongst the G20 leaders. But one of the things that Lula used this opportunity to do is to launch the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger. Remembering that during Lula's first 2 terms, he was able to take Brazil off of the hunger map, which is a huge achievement, as well as lift millions of people out of poverty. In many ways, many people have studied and looked at Brazil examples under Lula and then China under Xi as complementary, huge efforts to lift millions and millions of people out of extreme poverty. But what we saw in Brazil, especially after the 2016 coup and the right-wing governments that came afterwards, is that there was a huge reversal of those gains. In fact, under the Bolsonaro government, 33 million people, Brazilians, fell back into hunger. And that's a huge crime, for the largest agricultural producer in the world, that people still go hungry and millions more are food insecure. So the thing is, looking back at, we were just talking about the 1960s, the linkages between revolutionary movements and peasant movements between China and Brazil, is that Brazil didn't go through a revolutionary process, and it didn't go through an even softer sort of agrarian reform process. What the peasant leagues were fighting for then, and what, in ways, successor movements like the Landless Rural Workers Movement, or the MST today, which is the largest peasant movement, largest social movement in Latin America, is still fighting for, still carrying that banner. Because the reality is, in Brazil today, huge land, the distribution is highly unequal. The agricultural model of production is dominated by agribusiness, the big transnational companies, huge landowners that produce monoculture commodities, commodities that get traded into international market, but doesn't do anything to actually feed the people. So one of the things I think have been really interesting as a potential kind of model, let's say, of a different type of cooperation between Brazil and China started in the last year, where it includes MST and other social movements like that, the governments of the northeast of Brazil, the northeastern states, including with Chinese government, business, and university partners. They've actually started doing something, is bringing Chinese machinery that have been developed because of this land reform process, that's developed for small-scale family farmers in China. They're starting to bring those to Brazil in these poorer regions, into the settlements of the peasant movements and small-scale farmers in Brazil who don't have any access to machinery today. And they're being tested now. And the whole goal is that in the next years, they will start to build factories cater to the needs of Brazil, in Brazil, with the technology transfer from Chinese companies and experiences. So this kind of thing could really help revolutionize the type of production model in the poorest regions of the country, but also for those who are actual food producers, not just commodity producers. So I think there's exciting things that we're hoping to see more of that kind of cooperation, because we know one of the big things is that China buys a lot of the soy that oftentimes it's filled with contradictions. A lot of people are now burning their Amazon forests to be able to, produce soy that gets sold back to China. So we need another kind of model that actually benefits the environment, benefits the small scale family farmers, and also, helps to modernize the agricultural production in other global South countries like Brazil.
Wow, that's really exciting to see that kind of, win-win cooperation between Brazil and China. And if viewers are interested in learning more about that relationship, Tings, as you mentioned, you have a new article on Monthly Review Online that came out just this morning. And I also really encourage people to check out your essay that was released last month on People's Dispatch on your reflection of the Long March. Tings, we really appreciate having you on. It's always great. And, you're a wonderful guest, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's always so much fun to be on here, and I really love your show. So I promote it wherever I go, and it's an honor to be here.
Amazing. And maybe you should let people know if they want to check out more of your work, where can they find you?
You can find me on Twitter or X, Instagram. You find my name, Tings Chak. And yeah, you can always shoot me a message, and always looking forward to connecting with more people.
The other little piece that I didn't touch on, but I think is really also ties to the current moment, is that Xi Jinping has said that China is currently embarked on a new long march. And I don't think that's simply a metaphor. It literally is. The United States has encircled China along the first island chain, along Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, Philippines. And you see the Belt and Road as similar to the Long March. It's a kind of a counter encirclement campaign, escaping from this encirclement. But I think, the spirit of the Long March endures to this moment, not only in its example, but in the urgency of the current moment.
No, I think that's a really important point. And it's also this idea of, the countryside, surrounding the cities now that, Belt and Road Initiative, but also the Global South, this is really the language that gets revived today, as well as protracted war, which has been constantly cited in the last years. So this history is valuable and resourced, sadly, to understand our current moment.
Absolutely. I was just looking at an interview with a young child, and somebody asked him, "What is the spirit of the Long March?" And they said, "The spirit of the Long March is self-sacrificing and never giving up." And I thought, that's a great summary.
Well, to end it, we have a really nice video from friend of the show, Mimi. Mimi recently moved to China a few months ago, and ever since they've been updating us on their Instagram about daily life in China. This one in particular is about community centers. And in their words, these are a terrific example of socialism in action and what it looks like to encourage people of all ages to participate in society, engage with community, and learn new skills. So if you're not familiar with Mimi's work, I'd encourage you to Google them, look them up on Instagram, and follow them, because they regularly update with these kinds of videos in China, and they're really interesting and engaging. But that's it for this week. If you like this episode, please like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week on the China Report.
Hi everyone! Today I will be taking you to some local community centers in Shanghai. Look how huge this one is. They are located in every neighborhood, each of them offering health service, rest spaces, and free classes for all ages. These are some of the activity rooms which are dedicated to calligraphy, dance, drama, puzzles, language, and more. They're usually libraries in these centers full of literature, CDs, and books for everyone. My favorite thing is that these centers provide free classes that allow elders to try skills they may have not been able to when they were younger, just like this. Here's a chess room, a dance studio, a painting classroom, as well as a table tennis room. And there are plenty of outdoor spaces for children to learn skills as well. It is transformative to see socialism in action and experience spaces that are dedicated to the needs and leisure of the people. Here, people can nourish their interests, connect with each other, and stay active and healthy, just like these uncles here.